Welcome to the first actual lecture of this course. Now, there is a good chance that this course is going to be your very first contact with any web development. And so, before we start writing HTML and CSS code, I think it might be a good idea to actually begin this course with a very high-level overview of this field of web development. So we're going to talk about things like clients and servers, front-end and back-end development, static and dynamic websites, and of course about the core languages and core technologies of web development. And I'm going to explain all this around the process that happens when we open up a web page in a browser. Just keep in mind, again, that this is just a high-level overview, and so I'm going to leave out a lot of details here. This is really just so you get familiar with some of these concepts and terms that all web developers know before you start your own journey. But anyway, let's say that we're trying to access a web page in our browser at omnifoot.dev. And by the way, this is actually the website that we're going to develop throughout this course. Now, what happens as we try to access this page is that our browser will send a request to the server where this page is hosted on the internet. So each and every website is stored on something called a server, which is basically a computer that is connected to the internet and is able to receive requests like this one. So again, when we browse to a certain website, our web browser will send a request to the server where the website is stored, so where it is hosted. Then, when the server receives the request, it will take all the files that make up the website and send them back to the browser. And so we say that the server sends a response to the browser, which essentially contains all of these files that the website is made of. Now, as you can see from these file extensions, we have some HTML, CSS, and also JavaScript code here. And these are precisely the three languages that browsers can understand. So what this means is that all of the code that makes up a website needs to always be written in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Because, again, these are essentially the three core technologies that any browser can understand. All right, now once the browser receives these HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files from the server's response, it will take the code and render the website that we were trying to access. So based on that code. Okay? And with this, you already have a good understanding of what actually happens when we browse to a website, and also about the technologies that we use to build any website. And that process of writing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code that the browser can understand is a process that we call front-end web development. So whenever you hear someone talking about front-end development, what they mean is developers writing the code that is displayed in the browser, which is basically the front end of a website. And in fact, this is essentially what we're going to learn in this course, or at least the very, very fundamentals of front-end development, which is learning HTML and CSS. Now, just as a side note here, whenever the files that make up the website are simply stored on the web server and are then sent to the browser as they are, we say that we have a static website. Okay? And this will make a little bit more sense in a minute when we talk about what a dynamic website is. But for now, just keep in mind that a static website is basically a website where the files are simply sent from the server to the browser as they are, so without any transformations. All right? So I hope that from this, you learned what front-end development is, and also about the three core technologies that make up any website. And so now, let's take it one step further and talk about something called back-end development. So let's try another example here. And this time, let's try to understand what would happen when we try to access a website like udemy.com. So once again, the first step is that a request is sent to the web server where udemy.com is hosted. Now, why is a website like Udemy so different from something like the static Omnifoot website that I showed you earlier? Well, a complex site like udemy.com is really completely different from a static site because there is a lot of content that is always changing all the time. Like on Udemy, there are always new courses and new reviews being added to the site, new ratings and new course length are calculated, for example, and really a bunch of other things like that are always happening. And so, in order to make a system like this work, udemy.com needs a whole application running on the server, and they also need a big database, which basically contains all the courses and all the reviews, all the users, and really all the content that is being displayed on their website. Now, to do all this, front-end technologies like HTML and CSS are simply not enough. So basically, with what you're going to learn in this course, you're not going to be able to build something like udemy.com. All right? So to write applications that are actually executed on web servers, developers use some kind of backend language like Node.js, PHP, or Python. So what these languages do is to take data out of a database and basically assemble that data into the final files that will then be sent to the browser as the response. And this whole process is called backend development because this is basically the invisible part of a website. And so it's the website's backend. Now, in this situation, we say that we have a dynamic website because the website is dynamically assembled from different pieces on the server. And that happens each time that someone visits the website. So returning to the example of udemy.com, in fact, each time that you visit Udemy, a new version of the website is going to be generated from their database and sent to your browser. Now, on the other hand, if Udemy was a static website, then the website files would already be sitting on the server, just waiting for someone to access them. Okay? So that's the big difference between static and dynamic. In static, the files are already done, and in dynamic, they first need to be generated by an application that is running on the server. All right, but now the rest of the process is actually the same as before. So these files are now ready to be sent to the browser as a response, which will then be converted to the final website like this one we see here of udemy.com. Great. Now, of course, there is no need for you to memorize all these names that I mentioned here, and also no need to deeply understand this process. All I want here is to give you an overview of what front-end and back-end actually are, what the browser and the server are, and also what static and dynamic websites are. Because I really think that this is going to be extremely helpful as you start your developer journey. But now, just to finish, let's take a closer look at the three languages of the front end. So HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And starting with HTML, HTML is responsible for the content of the page. So that's the text, the images, the buttons, and really all the content that you see on a web page is always written inside an HTML file. Then the CSS is responsible for the presentation of that content, so basically for styling and for laying out the elements on the web page. Now finally, JavaScript is the actual programming language of the front end. So it allows us to add dynamic and interactive effects to web pages. We can also use it to manipulate the content or the CSS, to load data from web servers, and even to build entire front-end applications, which we then call web applications. Now we can also use the analogy of nouns, adjectives, and verbs to make the separation of roles here a little bit easier to understand. So in this analogy, HTML represents the nouns. For example, saying that the P element is a paragraph. So paragraph is the noun here. The CSS then is the adjective because it basically describes the noun. For example, like this piece of CSS saying that the paragraph text is red. And so red is the adjective describing the noun. All right? Finally, JavaScript is of course the verb, like saying hide the paragraph. So we're actually doing something here. And so we have a verb. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. And with this, we finish our introduction to web development. And so we're now ready to start working with HTML and CSS code in this course.